let us have about 30 seconds of quiet just to centre ourselves, to feel ourselves in the presence of the spirit or whatever we choose to name it as. Thank you, friends. Over to you, Olivia, with the first question.
Thanks. Well, apologies for all the delays. I think we'll get straight to it. So I think we'll start by asking Paul Hodgkin to answer first, and then Paul Ingram, and then I think we'll be alternating a bit. And yes, we wouldn't normally use surnames, I think, but seeing as we have two Pauls, I think we've got to be a little bit clearer tonight. But anyway, first question is, when we think about the various crises facing us on the planet today, the climate emergency, various social justice issues, that can, quite understandably bring about a lot of fear and grief and anger. So how does your Quakerism help you to live with these?
Thank you, Olivia, and it's great to be everybody. It's slightly disconcerting that I can't see everybody, but it's great to be here. I was born a Quaker, and I went to Quaker school, and then in my 20s I left the society because it never really felt that I had chosen it, and I spent the next 40 years being an atheist. And then when I retired 7 years ago, I came back to Quakerism because I felt I wanted to understand I suppose the spiritual dimensions of life, and it just felt like coming home. And so that's what happened. And about the same time, I started getting depressed, not clinically depressed, but I started getting depressed every 3 or 4 days. I'm sure many of us have had this experience about the Earth crises, climate change and habitat destruction. And would happen every 6 or 8 weeks, and then it happened every 4 or 5 weeks, and it was becoming a real problem. So in about 2018, I decided that I really had to do something about it, encouraged by Kate, my wife, who said, "You've got to do something about this." So I thought about what I could do. And the thing that I really found myself wanting to do was to study it within how do we really turn into the Earth crises? How do we face into them fully and properly, and to do that at a level which involved the sacred? And so I enrolled on the Equipping for Ministry course that began in January 2019, just before lockdown. And that went on for 3 years and finished about a year ago, and was fantastically important to me. And it was a really great experience and a great group. We began before lockdown. We began meeting on Zoom every morning, and that morning meeting has persisted for over 3 years now, from 6:45 to 7:15, Monday to Saturday. And that was a real spiritual practice. And Equipping for Ministry provided a frame for looking at the Earth crises. But it didn't actually, there was very little in Equipping for Ministry about the Earth crises. So it was very much about how does Quakerism help me to do that? So that's where Quakerism fits in. But I think that I would also say that Quakerism, but what's happening with the Earth brings up so much grief, fear, and anger in us, that I think it's really essential to have a way of dealing with that. And I don't think Quakerism as such deals very well with expressed emotion, or emotions that are being deeply felt right there in the instant. And that the Earth crises, certainly for me, and I'm sure for many, many of us, bring up a huge anguish. And so I then, during Equipping for Ministry, I went on a Work That Reconnects workshop, a week's workshop, which is Joanna Macy's work over the last 30 or 40 years, looking at how we faced existential risk, really, but in particular the Earth crises and climate change. And that was very helpful. And I think in actually getting to express the emotions, to cry the tears, to feel the anger, to shake with the fear. And I think without that, it's really quite hard to move through this. But it's really important to do that in a place that's safe and where you can do that with people around who have experience of it. And I'm sure there are many other ways of doing it, but the work Reconnects was the one that I found and was really helpful. So I think it's two parts. One is Quakerism as a kind of methodology of sitting in silence and being, and not trying to grasp for solutions, and having a history of personal revelation held in a community that deepens over time, and a place that wasn't Quaker, where the depth of the emotions stirred by the earth crises could, to some small degree, be processed. So that's me.
Well, thank you, Paul. And would our other lovely Paul like to also give your response?
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you everybody for coming. I was listening to Paul just then and remembering my own origin story with friends, which was when I was 15, almost 16, and attending a CND march. And I joined that march with a Quaker family that lived down the road. I knew nothing about Quakers. And remembering back at that moment now reminds me just how bad my memory is, and how I project onto my past self certain qualities. So I always assumed that I was angry and fearful, and this was 1983. So we were closer to annihilation than even we on the march realized. The world had just come through two significant crises in 2 weeks. A mistake by the Soviets of the NATO exercise Able Archer, which they thought was preparation for a real nuclear war. And then 2 weeks earlier, the mistake by the Soviet early warning system of incoming from the US, and Stanislav Petrov refusing to pass the message up to his command. We were incredibly close to annihilation, and I project onto my young self a degree of anger. In fact, I always assumed that it was anger more than fear that was driving me. But now in this moment, thinking back, I remember that in the Quaker section of the march, it was all age, and it was passionate, but it was gathered. It had a huge impact on me, and it's been with me ever since, more than I realized. And for me, what Quakerism brings to what seems to be a hopeless situation again is a sense of humility and compassion, a commitment to discernment, and to an awareness of a not knowing, that if we think we are in control as individuals or even as groups, then we are mistaken, and that we are vassals of the divine, and the divine moves in mysterious ways. And that helps me in places where I feel hopeless.
Thank you. Can I then follow up on that? Moving response, Paul, is about, how can our Quaker lives preach in these times? What patterns and examples are you called to?
We are complicated animals. We have a great power of rationality, but we have feelings and emotions, and we have the capacity to reach out beyond our own individual experience. And that gives us power and responsibility. And the Quaker life in a period of extreme threat to our ways of life is one of openness and curiosity, and, as I said earlier, humility. We are called to open to the idea that we could be wrong, that others have valid experiences just as we do, that we are called to practice compassion, even to those that we feel disgust or anger or hostility towards, because we don't understand. It's an extraordinary legacy that we have as a society, where there has been periods of extraordinary righteousness, where we have felt as Quakers able to do things that elicit extraordinary reactions, and in the first few decades of the Quaker movement, we were willing to do things that would have been interpreted as quite hostile to other people's faiths. And that isn't, and I think that's a misinterpretation, but it underlines, I think, the importance of humility.
Thank you.
I think sorry, just to finish, the most powerful practice we can practice is forgiveness. Thank you.
Paul Hodgkin, over to you. You need to unmute, Paul.
Thank you. I think two things. One is it's easy to be over attracted to hope, or the notion that we should be hopeful, or that we have to be hopeful, and that hope can falsely bind up our hearts at precisely the time when they need to be opened by what we have done. And I think it's only through that opening that we get to a real sense of what we're being asked to do in these times. So I think it's not that I feel that hope is wrong, but I think it's not the place to start, and it can be quite a detour if you start just being hopeful, because there's so much fear around. So I think that one of the things that I feel much more strongly now, that if I try and see the whole in all its fearfulness, it's not that I've become hopeful or hopeless, I become more grounded. And this helps me to see what an awful time this is, in both senses, awful and also full of awe this is. And one of the things that helps me walk with resolve and some cheer, perhaps not cheerfully, is that this is just, as well as everything else, it is just the most incredible time to be alive. there is so much change going on. There are so many unfoldings and collapsings and endings and becomings. And it, of course, the age thinks it's the hinge of history, but where we are now, it seems to me that 500 years of history of Western, Northern, global, enlightened history is coming to an end, because the system on which it is basically based on the idea of separation, of idolatry, if you want to look at it that way, but of separation. And that is fundamentally wrong. And we know it's wrong at so many different levels now, from the mystic level through to the scientific, through to how we need to actually live together. So I think living these times fully is tremendously challenging and also awe-inspiring. What we have to do, or how we choose to live if we don't manage to do it, in the challenges that will come to us. And I think the last thing I want to say is something about what patterns we call to be. And I think the patterns that we're called to be and see and learn from are now at least as much non-human as they are human. That previous patterns, previous Quakerisms would have looked to other humans to see what patterns or to be what patterns. And I think that we are we're kind of in an ecology of love, and in an ecology. We learn from everybody. There is no leader, there is no hierarchy in an ecology.
Thank you, Paul. I think something you've kind of both touched on there really is this idea that there are various practices, you referred to your own earlier, Paul, practices, whether spiritual or kind of other in your life, that you can take on to try and approach these things. And I think what you're both touching on here is really the idea of empathy, to be honest. It's whether it's empathizing with our fellow beings who are human or non-human, and how do you make that leap, I guess, from how do you empathize as an individual to another person or another being, and how do we build a society and a culture and a world that is able to do that? And I guess I'm trying to work out really what the question I want to ask is here, because I think these are all such huge ideas and it feels a bit difficult to know how you even begin with that. So I guess maybe the question is whether you think of it as a practice of forgiveness or spiritual practices that are kind of maybe more technical in a sense. How do the practices you use, whether it's kind of being still or being guided, whether it's the discernment you talk about, how we discern things which are right or wrong, or what our view is, how do they help us look at the world with more loving eyes, with more forgiving eyes? And can you speak from your own experience of that, or what you might kind of almost recommend, I guess, for others that might be useful for them in doing that? And I think we started with Paul Ingram last time, so maybe back to Paul Hodgkin again, unless you would like a bit more time to think.
When I started on the very first presidential of Equity for Ministry at Woodbrook, Jill, the course leader, said, it doesn't matter what you do, but you have to have a spiritual practice. And you have to do something every day. It doesn't matter how long, but if you want to get anywhere, you have to practice like anything. Any skill or way of being, you have to practice. And that became the morning worship with the rest of most of the rest of the EFM group. And so I think that and one of the real benefits, the doors that have opened as a result of COVID, has been able to meet regularly for worship with other people every day if you want. It just would simply have not been possible before we all knew how to use Zoom. And it's not everything, is not something that everybody wants to do, but I think that it's like a gift. It's saying, here, we can do this. We can do this now. So within the Living Witness network that gathered in August, there's a group that started a morning worship, which will in time be open to other people. But it's just kind of establishing itself at the minute. And also, I think there's just huge potential for that daily practice based completely in Quakerism for us, but combining with that long tradition of Quaker social witness, so that groups that come together like Living Witness also worship together, and the two are twined together in a way that they've never been before, could never have been before. And who knows what's going to happen out of that? It's great. I don't know what's going to happen. Maybe nothing will happen. Maybe it'll be a real deepening of the social witness side. And Rachel Muirs, in her book about Quaker testimony, says testimony sets theology in motion, which is a great way of thinking about it. I think that testimony is the way in which we develop our theology as Quakers. Nothing is written down, but unless we have some testimonies which we go out there and live in the world in a social action kind of way, the theology doesn't develop, or it becomes very aerified and, you know, all that stuff that theology does. And that, so I think one of the things that really fills me with hope, proper hope for me, is that sense that as these times get worse, as these polycrises seemingly become more frequent, I don't know if they will, but they might well do, we now have the ability to form groups of worshipping on a daily or twice weekly or whatever it is, to sustain us and deepen the thought and the reflections that we're going to need to really live this time. And this is a door that's been opened to us. And I know there's lots of things about Zoom that are difficult and not straightforward and not so good as meeting face to face, and I accept all of that. But truly, what a fantastic thing to have been gift to have been given, to be able to link these two, link the really difficult times, the social witness that's required, and worship on a much more frequent and just there in the morning if you want it, or 9 o'clock in the evening or whatever. And Woodbrook do this as well, of course. It's not, you know, lots of people are doing this, but it's a fantastic that we're exploring that space.
Thank you, Paul. It sounds like what you feel is quite useful is quite a sort of an action-based approach. So during that daily practice, you know, kind of taking those steps, being part of that community, and kind of, yeah, I can say through that action, giving yourself the energy and kind of the time to reflect and be ready to face the challenges that, you know, we have approaching us. Paul, do you feel that? Oh,
can I add one? Can I add one thing to that, Olivia?
Of course.
I think it's deeper than that. It's about creating the beloved communities that we need.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, the beloved community in the old way was we all had to live together and we had to do the washing up together. And there was a great argument for doing that, for actually, you know, standing next to each other as we swept the floor. But the beloved community now it's much lighter. It's possible to find them much more easily without regard to distance or time zone or anything. And that's really what it is. It's a beloved worshipping community are easier to find now than they used to be. And isn't that just great?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Paul, what are your reflections on this?
So I have been working alongside many people that see the world quite differently from me, and I see those as opportunities to learn in a mutual way. I feel that I have my own practice, and that can bring me closer to an awareness of who I am and my relationship with others and with the divine, and that is an opportunity for connection rather than separation. And I don't judge others' ability to engage in the same or different practices. And I have things to learn from the nuclear weapon commander who commands his submarine and who has a sense of service and fellowship with the 130 odd other souls in that tin can at the bottom of the sea. And if I open myself to their experience and their stories and their understanding of what it is they're doing, I can enrich and deepen my sense of how the divine works through them. And that's a bit of a strange thing to say for a Quaker, possibly, and yet it is fundamental to my Quakerism that I understand that I have so much to learn, that my perspective is so partial, and that each and every moment is an opportunity to deepen my compassion and understanding for people who experience the world differently. And when I travel to Moscow or to Tehran, and I speak to the Russians and the Iranians that I frequently meet and talk to, I find a humanity there that is both surprising, because I'm given stories about how unhuman people are, and exciting and enriching. And those experiences of connection are, for me, as powerful and as discerning and as connecting to the spirit as the Quaker meetings that meet in my house here. And in many respects, in some respects, more powerful because of the difference and the diversity, the way in which I face the contradictions in my own perspective. And I find that that's more powerful if I make myself vulnerable. And when I experience that as an individual, I also then see the deeper truth behind concepts that we have been talking about for decades, like common security and sustainability and other visions and objectives that guide our political action, because these are about how collective groups of human beings can make themselves vulnerable to each other and to grow.
Thank you very much. It works quite well with the question that comes in from Jan Arians, this both and either or dynamic. Jan writes, Paul Hodgkin argues for a wholesale change in approach in the form of a new covenant. By contrast, Jan writes, Paul Ingram calls for a gradualist step-by-step approach. Are these two approaches compatible? Who'd like to go first with that one?
I'm happy to go first because I see them as completely compatible. Mm-hmm. The step-by-step approach, or as I came to call it, the stepping stones approach that guides the international consortium of 16 countries working on nuclear disarmament, involves radical visions of change in our society, and it involves humility and an understanding that the vision is not necessarily somewhere where we will end up. But we need to be thinking radically, and we need rapid change in the way states relate to one another. But if we attach ourselves to a particular solution in a situation of complexity where there are already many solutions that are competing, and where people are divided by their disagreements and their conflicts of interest and values, then we just become part of the problem. And if we are to transform it and transform the process into one of collaboration and engagement, we have to be open to the possibility that our suggestions for movement are simply openings in the dialogue and engagement. And that requires us to be ready for a process that takes time and demands patience, even whilst there is no time. And the contradiction at the heart of what I'm talking about is the contradiction that runs throughout reality, where there are no blacks and whites and good and evil, and right and wrong. There is simply a question of open discernment with curiosity and humility.
Thank you. Paul Hodgkin. You need to unmute.
I thought I had. It's great listening to you, Paul, really. I think, and it's a great question. My feeling, my sense of it, and the way I choose to live is that it's not a choice. The big change is already upon us. It's not a question of having a gradualist or a complete change. The complete change is already happening because the system that we have of separation, of thinking that we have dominion over the earth and everything that crawls upon it, is clearly wrong. We do not have dominion. We are sustained by the earth. We are part of it. And so the earth crises are foreclosing the future that we thought we had. And that's what's scary. And so when what I think is happening, and this is what I think is happening, is that the elites, if we want to think about it in those terms, can see this happening as well as we can, that the system cannot go on, and they don't know what to do about it. And an awful lot of the very destructive politics that's going on is because of that. And that it came home to me most when I heard Keir Starmer say what we need is growth, growth, growth. Because there's nothing else to put in the place if you're thinking that the system of consumer capitalism is going to continue. So we are faced with that breakdown, and I think that breakdown is already happening. It may not go to completion, but it's already happening. And so within that, that's the context. There isn't any choice about that. It's not about we have to work to bring the revolution upon us. It is that the system is breaking down around us. And within that, it's often the only thing you can do, I think, wisely, is to do gradualist steps to discern what the next thing to do is. But it's within the context, for me, of incipient collapse. And I think that it's important, well, let's hope that we are mistaken in this. but it's also important to speak the truth that it may be happening. And so I think that in time, it might be that Quakers evolve a testimony against capitalism and growth. And what would that mean? And those seems to a testimony against advertising. You know, advertising is what turns Amazon into Amazon Prime and Eros into erotica. And what would it be to take a stand against those things as a result, a reflection of the wider collapsings that are going on around us?
Thank you, Paul. And I was struck by that that bit about having compassion for one another and insight into people's different experiences, or insight into other people finding their way in the way that they're led to. And there's a note from Beth here saying that one of her daughters is at COP27, and she says she's there to meet people and says the whole world is there. And so I think, thank goodness, we've got some good-hearted, loving-centered people having those conversations. Beth also says when this daughter went to a Quaker meeting and mentioned her work, which is sustainability work for an energy company, which used to be an oil company, she said she was treated like a leper at a Quaker meeting. And we can so easily fall into that pit of making a judgment and, yeah, not being loving and open and not applauding someone for working perhaps in a very difficult environment with their truths. So thank you. Olivia, over to you.
I mean, I think, as Beth was saying in that question there, she was interested in hearing more, particularly from Ingram, sorry, about how you work with allies who you do disagree with. And I guess maybe a wider question is, how can we kind of get comfortable with being vulnerable and being compassionate with people who do things, or, you know, are behaving in ways, or maybe working in industries that we find really, really difficult, maybe even disgusting or kind of horrific? You know, in your experience, Paul, how did you kind of manage that? Like, was it purely just trying to see the other side, or were there other elements involved?
Thank you. As with everything, it's a journey. I used to be a Green politician. I was elected and then became leader of Oxford City Council. But as leader, I had to engage in a great deal of compromise and interpretation. I was elected as a Green politician. I had a radical agenda, but the world is not a mechanistic world where you pull a lever and something happens. It's a very human world with very different objectives and perspectives, experiences, legacies, cultures, and we are called to just take the steps to understand the differences and to have compassion for them. People do terrible things, and they almost always have reason. I do bad things, and I judge myself, and then I hold my actions. I hold myself to account, but in the end, life goes on. And if I just carry on beating myself up, or if I allow the self-critic in my head to have the better of me, I'm no use to anybody. And I think Beth also asked possibly the most powerful question of all, which is, what can any of us do? I started out as somebody who was polishing their cape every morning to try to save the world. And I've come to realize that that is an illusion, that actually the best thing I can do wherever I am, whether I'm working with people in the military, or whether I am talking to members of the peace movement, or whether, as today, I was planning a new project with former Secretary of State for Defense. I move in circles that are highly privileged, but the answer to the question is the same for all of us, which is to be in connection with each other, with our context within the ecosystems within which we sit, and with the divine, and to practice the spiritual divine agenda that we have every moment of every day. That action is itself discernment, and discernment is action. These are not separate. And that God speaks in all sorts of mysterious ways and through people that we judge harshly. And when I think today about the nuclear threats that President Putin is making, and the challenge there is to me frequently made of how we deal with Putin, what do we do if Putin drops a bomb, a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, which is the question that I was trying to answer today, when on the one hand, to allow him to get away with it is to give license to future activity like that. And on the other, to respond in some harsh way is to not only threaten the possibility of nuclear annihilation for all of us, but actually reinforces the message that might is right. It's not possible for us to make sense of this rationally. And the process, the journey that we are all called to travel along is one of humility, understanding that none of us have the answers. But what we need to be doing is looking for ways of improving the situation through building trust, through making ourselves vulnerable, through changing the narrative away from security and dominance to one of patience and acceptance, understanding and forgiveness, and all the qualities that each and every spiritual practice around the world is seeking to deepen in the human condition, and to ask ourselves, how does this call, what does this call of us here today in this moment, as I go about my life shopping and thinking about sustainability, how I get around the world without burning it up, and how I engage with people from very different perspectives in ways that can build true community and fellowship.
Thank you, Paul. Paul H, it looks like you were moving into.
Yeah, I could listen to you forever, Paul. It's great, really helpful. I think the only thing I'd want to add to that is that to answer Beth's question about what can we do, and it's like I think that the local is really, really important in grounding us, and the local. It helps, maybe a bit artificial, but it helps to think about not just my local community, but my local watershed, because the watershed is the area that defines the ecology in which I live. So which includes the humans. And at some point in the land, the water begins to flow to the west, and a foot the other way, it begins to flow to the east. And that is the earth defining the community in which we live. So that's a helpful way of anchoring community into the ecology. And nobody but the people in that watershed really, really care for the watershed like the people who live in it do. So a way of anchoring myself and my community and trying to make the connections which will help the community survive the coming crises is what what gives me a lot of satisfaction. So which is all carried out through the local non-Quaker environmental action group that I'm part of. But it's that the purpose of that for me is about building relationships and conversations and listening across the divides which normally wouldn't get spoken across within my little town of 10,000 people. So I think the local is a really great place to start and be grounded, and to work outwards and upwards from there as you're led.
I think that's something you both seem to be coming back to really, really strongly all throughout the conversation, and in both your articles. I think while you kind of focus on different things, you really do seem to be all about connection and how we connect with others, and try to find ways to relate and be vulnerable and build trust and those relationships, have those conversations, difficult as they may be. You mentioned something earlier, Paul Hodgkin, about hope not being the place to start, which I thought was very thought-provoking for me personally. And we've got a question from Paul Nicholas. He said that a character in Alan Waters' play Resilience said something like, "It's the time to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable." And Paul said, another Paul, I think hope is important. And those words, actually from a not very sympathetic character in the play, gave me some room for hope. And essentially it's asking for your comment, but how do we kind of use hope, or should we use hope to try and avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable?
I think for me, hope is important, and again, Joanna Macy's active hope is a really good model for this. It's just not I'm suspicious about starting at hope, and that what we do needs to be grounded in truth, I think. Yeah, and of course, and the truth involves a multi-layered, complex process that's much more complex than hope. So, and I think it also means being able to speak the truth. I think people are, when I've had conversations, people have had the conversations already about recycling. They've had the conversations already about parts per million. They've had the conversations about extinctions. I think what we all are yearning for is a conversation at a deeper level about, okay, so what does this mean, both for how we live and for the changes that are coming, and the spiritual nature of the challenges that we have. So when I don't feel I'm very good at this, but when I do speak about the spiritual nature of the questions that we confront, I think you can feel people turning. Like I could feel myself turning to listen to you, Paul, as you were talking out of your experience of dealing with really, really difficult conflict areas. And when you speak from the heart about these things, it goes so much more than talking about hope, which people tend to go, yeah, and then the hope doesn't work, and we feel let down again. And so, and I guess it comes back to what you said, Paul, about making yourself vulnerable. To talk about the sacred in the earth crises does make me feel when I do it, vulnerable.
Yesterday, I was asked to address a group of country directors and project managers from the International Federation of Red Cross operating across Eastern Europe, Russia and Ukraine. And my task was to outline some of the existential risks we face and the possible cascade effects that are happening already and that could accelerate. and then to focus on the Ukraine conflict and the risk of nuclear exchange and some of the other scenarios. And at the end of speaking for 40 minutes or so, I realized that I was giving people very little reason to hope. And that is a professional trap in my world, working for the Centre for the End of the World. But it is important that we are realistic. And I think I can say hand on heart, as a former politician, a former TV talk show host, and now an academic, a trainer of government officials, and working in all sorts of diverse parts of the world, I can say hand on heart that the lifestyles to which we have become accustomed are lost. It's a question of when rather than whether. But the lifestyles upon which we have come to become, to depend for our sense of who we are the problem. And so change is inevitable. So when I hear the quote from the Alan Waters play, to avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable, my response is, that's impossible. Because we live in a world that is not about managing in the sense that it is far too complex for us to understand what is going on, and has become so out of control that more than half of the people in my centre working on existential risk are looking at the runaway technology of digital and computer generated intelligence, and the way in which we already are losing the ability to control the consequences of these technologies, and they interact with each other. Artificial intelligence running nuclear command and control systems, killer robots able to work in swarms to the extent that those states that will be able to deploy this technology in the very near future will be unstoppable. Quantum computing, meaning that it's impossible for future financial systems to be stable. The world that we currently know its time is numbered, but that doesn't mean that we have to accept that we will become extinct. It just means that we face an uncertain world. And my hope arises from the experience I had as a teenager in 1983 on that CND march, when I was convinced that the world would be blown up within the next decade. And here we are, 4 decades later. And yes, we still haven't escaped that challenge and that threat, but we have moved through a transition that was unforeseen by anybody, the end of the Cold War. And what is unforeseen is not necessarily all bad. And I think if we can find faith and connect with each other and with the divine, that provides greater true underlying hope than any attempt to try and manage the situation using rational thought or the machines and the technologies that we have developed.
Thank you both. Thank you, friends, for being with us. It's felt like a very profound evening where we have had images of polishing our capes. But the invitation is to be members of beloved worshipping communities, to share our truths, to be kind and generous and loving to people in our watershed and beyond, to bind our hearts to goodness, to our sense of the divine, to be grounded, to be hopeful, in good measure, and to know that the local is as important as the global, the both and. I think we've had our vision stretched, our hearts embraced, and I thank you all, but particularly our two Pauls this evening. Thank you all very much.